You guys have been waiting for it, I have been waiting for it, and we finally have all of the material on hand that we need to get started on building the F40 chassis. So today we are going to dive in and start that long, tedious process of building a chassis from scratch. Let's get to it. If you're somehow new here and new to this series, we're building an F40. But it's not a normal F40. What we're building here is a custom tube chassis underneath original Ferrari bodywork. That means this F40 is going to be something more akin to an F40 EVO or F40 XX, neither of which exist yet. This particular episode is where the fun begins because today we dive into building this tube chassis from scratch. But before we're cutting any steel and shaping any metal, there's a lot of setup involved. In episode 2 of this build series, we built our chassis table and set up the F40 bodywork on top of it to at least resemble the car. Then we took measurements off of Nigel Mansell's F40 so we could copy them for our own. Now it's time to make use of those dimensions, and that means locking the F40 bodywork down in place on the chassis table in very specific locations. It's going to serve as an important reference for everything moving forwards. Luckily for once, I planned ahead, and 5 or 6 months ago, I ordered a lot of parts and pieces from our friends at StanceWorks. Each one of these has a slightly different function, some to locate the bodywork itself, and others to locate the tube work that we're going to build inside of it. Using the CAD model of our chassis table, I built all of these parts in Fusion 360 to be exact in dimension. And then I let StanceWorks handle the rest of it because not only can they cut the parts, they can bend them too. For a number of these parts though, we're going to need to do some welding, so it's time to get out the Dynasty. And honestly, I'm excited for this because in the last 6 months, I really haven't gotten to do very much welding. I enjoy it, but I feel like I've gotten a bit rusty, so this offers the perfect opportunity to brush up on some of those skills and make sure that the welds on the car itself are going to look as good as everything else. The parts that we're assembling are tube stands. They serve a few different purposes, primarily to hold tube work off of the work surface. But the pair of points at the top also allows us to somewhat precariously balance flat stock as well. I designed these stands in several different heights so that we have some variability or adjustment as we go forward, and I designed them with a tab and slot construction method so that they will roughly square up as they get welded. It's a relatively simple design, but it makes sure that they all go together the same way and they are square and true. For material, it's just 3/16 cold rolled steel. Simple and effective. I want to make sure these are strong enough to hold anything that we put on top of them, including things like the weight of the engine, gearbox, or the car itself. As with every project on this channel, it's my hope to always inspire others, and I want to remind you that you guys can also make parts that look as good as these. If you go to sendcutsen.com/StanceWorks or just hit the link in the description, you'll get 15% off your next order and elevate your project at the same time. With our chassis table components built, it's time to put them to use. Our next goal is to get both rocker panels of the F40 body set up on the table. We've got to make sure that they are centered on our work surface, front to back and side to side. We also want to make sure that they are tapered correctly and set up as though they are on an actual car. But given that we don't have an actual car to attach this stuff to, we've got to do a lot of measuring. And this isn't one of those measure twice, cut once scenarios. We don't get a second shot with this bodywork, so we're going to measure a dozen times over from every direction you can name. I want to make sure this measures out in every possible way so that the car turns out just right. First on our list is to find the center line of the table. This is going to act as a home base of sorts for dimensions as we make progress. With a line drawn on the table, we can reference this at any time. We're going to measure from this point outwards as we begin to set up the bodywork. Based on the dimensions that we took from the other F40, I know that I want each rocker panel to be 675 millimeters from the center line of the table to the outside surface. But the outside surface is contoured, and that makes it somewhat tough to measure. So what other fixed points can we measure from to make sure that we get each side of this symmetric? Well, there are some simple hard edges we can measure to, such as the inside flat surface or one of the cuts in the bodywork, but it became pretty apparent that there is a difference from side to side, a pretty big one. This side measures out to 3 1/8 of an inch or 79 millimeters for the rest of the world, and yes, I believe the metric system is superior, but I've got to work with the tools I've got, so bear with me as the project goes on. The other side, though, is 10 millimeters shorter, measuring out to 69 or almost 70 millimeters, so that's something I'm gonna have to account for. But I've got a trick up my sleeve that I'm going to show you here later in the episode, so bear with me. We've got the front end lined up and loosely held into place, so now it's time to turn our attention to the tail end of the rocker panels. And this process is exactly the same as the front. We're going to find the center line of the table and then measure outwards to the panels themselves. We know that the F40 is wider at the back than it is the front. The rocker panels have a taper to them, and we confirm this with the measurements we borrowed from Nigel Mansell's car. Another shout out to Jacob at IM Detailing, because without these measurements, we wouldn't be able to get this car sitting perfect. The taper of the bodywork from front to rear isn't something that we can just look up on the internet, and it's also not information that's readily available. This likely isn't something many people have needed in the past because, well, why would you? On an F40 restoration, these parts just bolt on. But with the bodywork set in the correct position, it's time to clamp it into place, and this brings us back to one of my favorite old segments, new tools. Let me tell you about these clamps. These are every machinist's favorite clamp. They are can't twist clamps, and I'll be honest, this is a tool I've wanted for a long time but have waited until now to buy because it's kind of hard to stomach the cost of them. Just these small clamps are like 35, almost 40 bucks a piece. But I think any machinist or real fabricator is going to tell you they're well worth it because they've got some pretty cool features, and as far as I've ever been told, they are the best clamps you can get. Let me show you why. First, let's look at an old-fashioned C-clamp. The screw itself is attached to a foot, and by tightening it on our work surface, we are imparting a twisting motion upon it. This can cause the pieces that we're clamping to shift and move about, and that is not ideal. It's the one flaw to a tool like this, but can't twist clamps clearly are constructed a bit differently. Now, to be clear, they aren't without their drawbacks, but they have one major improvement over an old-fashioned C-clamp. By operating the screw to open or close the clamp, we are not imparting a twisting force upon the clamping surface. It's operating the jaw itself, and the clamping surface actually pivots. It makes sure that they are always parallel together, and that means whatever we're clamping simply isn't going to move as the clamp closes. It also makes it easier to clamp things that are off-axis or not flat or parallel surfaces. They come in a lot of different sizes, and as said, although they are expensive, they're super useful, and I'm gonna be honest, I've wanted a set of these for a long time. They're no match for the brute force strength of a forged C-clamp, but they have their place, and it's perfect for our project today. I'm using our can't twist clamps, some scrap steel, some Fireball tool squares, some 1-2-3 blocks, and a ton of other materials to get these panels clamped into place. This isn't a permanent fixture, but I want them all in their final position for one of the steps coming up here in a few. Now, I have no idea if what you guys are watching is as interesting to you as it is to me, but I am in my element. I'm having a blast getting all of this stuff set up, and if you're enjoying it too, you should hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. And if you're not enjoying it, well, Come back in a couple years, or just leave a mean comment. I'll read it either way. Now, back to that side-to-side difference I mentioned earlier. We've spent a bunch of time measuring from the center line of the table to our parts to make sure that the inside of the parts and the structure that we're about to build is going to be square. But there's one variable here that we haven't accounted for, and that's the fact that these parts are not the same side to side. They're just not built with that level of craftsmanship, if you will. And it's made evidenced by these numbers that we already recorded right here. The cut to the inside dimension isn't the same. What if this dimension is different, say 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 inch, or a whole inch? We need to make sure that even if the center of the car and the structure that's inside of it is going to be square and true, that the bodywork of the car doesn't get all put together and wind up with one side of the car with more taper than the other, or just having some weird gaps. It's something I don't want to deal with in the future. So I needed a way to come up and make sure that everything is going to check out once we get further down the road. And that's the nice thing about this chassis table, is that we can fixture to the side of it. I've taken this big piece of precision ground steel, which cannot flex, it's not going to move, and I've clamped it to the side, and that gives me a really nice square level surface that I can measure to. And now I can measure from this surface to the outside of the panels and to the inside of the panels and check from side to side. If I repeat this on both sides of the car and at all four corners, again, I can make sure that not only is the inside of the bodywork all set up, but that the outside is symmetric and that everything is going to check out once we build this entire thing. But there's still one other variable that we're not thinking about right now, and that's the fact that these cuts where it interacts with the factory F40 chassis are also different. And I can't really utilize these kind of dimensions and these voids to build what I want to build. There's a lot of unknowns as we venture into building a structure that isn't here based on a car that we don't have. So let me show you what I've got over on the computer. Now, what I have here is not mine to share, and I can't really tell you where I got it, but this is a completely accurate CAD model of an original F40 chassis. Now, some of you already realize that this doesn't help us in terms of design. We're not building a chassis that looks anything like the original F40. We're not trying to replicate it. We're not building an F40. We're building something better. But what I can use this model for is for reference, especially when it comes to where body panels attached to the original chassis, what some of those dimensions were, and where things clear and where they don't, especially for things like where did the original firewall land, how much does our new engine need to stick through it, where will the seats need to land in respect to that, where were the original seat mounts, where do they need to go moving forward. We can use some of our current 3D models and 3D scans and combine it with this file to start planning for our build and seeing what's going to make sense, what's going to work, what's going to fit. And although none of this will really be present in our final model, it's a beautiful and incredible reference for us to use as we try to get this thing off the ground, especially for getting the bodywork set up. So let me show you guys a little bit of what I've set up already in CAD, because this is pretty sick. Now, if I come over here and I turn on the rest of the parts that I've spent the time to design in CAD, which includes the chassis table in perfect 1:1 scale, as well as all the platforms that we have our bodywork mounted to in their correct locations. We can also turn on the 3D scan of our engine, roughly where I believe that it's going to go. We can turn on the gearbox, and we can turn on the bodywork, which is not our scan, but it should be pretty accurate to see exactly how all of these parts are going to interact together. This is an incredible tool, and again, I just want to iterate, the factory F40 chassis is not what we are building. It's not really going to look anything like that. We're not using any of the suspension from the F40. We're not using any of the geometry from it. We're really only using this as a reference for how our parts and pieces can interact in 3D space with what was there, with how the body's set up. And we can kind of build and do a lot of planning in this, and then we can take what we're building and insert it into this same file and begin to replace the factory F40 chassis with the chassis and parts that we are building. This is without question one of the best, most spectacular things anybody has ever supplied or given to me. You know who you are, thank you so much. Again, this is not my file to let you guys have and download, and I apologize, but again, this is going to transform the project, and right now what's really handy and how we're measuring at the moment is that I can zoom in and I can take measurements off of some of these original chassis parts to see exactly how far apart Ferrari had it set up, how the body mounted to the original chassis, so that we can replicate that on our chassis and make sure that the car is going to turn out correct, and I'm stoked. So now we can take the dimensions from our CAD model and combine them with all of the other work we've done so far to make sure this thing measures out correctly. And it looks good. I'm happy with where we're at, but there's still one remaining question. Is there a way to confirm that we've got any of it right in the real world? Well, I've got one idea for it. All right, I think now the real test will be to see how the hood fits with kind of the upright portions of the rocker panels. Picking this up solo it's not heavy, but it's a little sketchy because I don't want to drop it. But let's see if it fits. Some of you might be wondering if it's absolutely terrifying handling a hood like this, and the answer is yeah, I'm still not used to it. A replacement from Ferrari after taxes and shipping is pushing nearly $40,000. I can't afford that, and I didn't pay anywhere close to that, but I figure if I don't at least get comfortable handling the bodywork of this car, I won't ever get comfortable with the car as a whole. So I might as well do it to it. I can get it all lined up. That's pretty close. So the front of the hood does need to come up still. I know that much. We'll use our file to check that, but I'm pretty excited. Keep in mind, these pieces are flexible. Like, there's some movement. The hood has some flex, and when you tighten those latches down, it'll pull it all into alignment. But over here, it's perfect. It looks great. Over here, there's a wee bit of misalignment. I mean, like, boom, done. And as we actually attach everything to a chassis, it'll all help pull it into alignment. It's also just, I just set it down. We're looking really good. That cements that these are exactly where we want them. I feel really good about it. I mean, yeah, that lines up better than it has at any point prior. This is a good sign. So based on the measurements we took off the other F40, based on the CAD drawing that we have of the original chassis, and based off the bodywork itself, everything is lining up, and I feel really good about the direction we're heading. But now the question is, how can we lock all of these panels permanently into place without all of these pesky clamps in the way? The front end of the rocker panels will require a custom solution, but the back end of the rocker panels has holes in it already. They were originally used to mount the wheel well liners. We could repurpose those holes for the time being as mounting locations to bolt this to the table permanently. To do that, we'll need custom brackets, and that means whipping out my favorite Bad Obsession Motorsport tool, the pen and paper. Now obviously this fits pretty well on the passenger side of the car, but this is the first piece to reveal just how different this car is side to side, and it kind of illustrates some of the trouble I'm having in making sure this entire body is set up correctly. I know you guys can't see it all too well from this angle, but as I hold this up to this side, it is just completely and utterly different. It's not even close to fitting in the same way that it does the other side. So it's clear the molds are different, and that's why we're measuring not only from the part itself, but from the outside of the table to the part to the middle of the table, and really trying to make sure everything is taking into account the fact that the panels might not be the same side to side. But I've got our measurements all confirmed, everything's mounted in the same place, so this just requires a different design in bracketry from side to side. I whipped these up in CAD as very simple models that we can have cut from our friends at Send Cut Send, and we'll get them back here in about a week. Their purpose is very simple. They will use the existing bolt holes at the rear of the rocker panels, and I'll add a few holes at the front. We'll bolt the brackets to the bodywork and then clamp the brackets to the table and call this done. The bodywork is permanently in place until the project is finished. And that's good news because it's finally time to move on. Our fabrication materials that we ordered have finally arrived. There is a truckload of steel that will eventually become an F40 chassis. This is Docal R8 tubing, and I'm going to explain more about it later in the episode and why I've chosen to use it. Right now, we just got to figure out how to get 15 sticks that measure 20 feet long out of the back of a truck. Look, I'm not forklift certified and probably have no business running this thing, but eventually we did manage to get it out of the truck. And then the second situation was how to get it into the shop. It's far too wide to drive through the door, so it required a bit of pushing and a bit of manhandling thanks to Byron. Along with our Docal tubing, I've also got a lot of 1x2 inch rectangular square stock of mild steel. I'm going to touch upon all of the material choices at the end of the episode. It's a very nerdy rant that I know some of you guys just aren't here for, so tune in at the end if you want to understand the materials going into this project and why I've chosen them. So with material here, what are we going to build first? The answer is at least a rough draft of the base of our chassis. This will essentially be the floor structure. We're going to start this project from the bottom and move upwards. It will be what the roll cage attaches to, such as the main hoop and the A-pillar bars, and where those specific bars terminate is critical in how the rest of the car is going to shape up. So, the four corners of the structure that we're about to build all need to land in the exact right place. I want to cut some material, make sure it's going to fit the way that I want it to inside of the car, and then we've got a bit more problem solving to do. Now comes one of those segments that I'm unsure of how to share. What does building a car actually look like? Well, a lot of it, sure, it's fabrication, but a ton of it is planning, problem solving, figuring out a course of action, and figuring out how to execute upon it. There's no one single sole answer for any of the questions that we will have to ask as we progress through this project, and so much of the time between now and completion will be spent simply problem solving, figuring, trying to understand the hurdles that lie ahead, and thinking as many moves forward as possible. This is one place that I am happy to be integrating CAD into my workflow. With the chassis that I've built in the past, this was not an option, but now I'm able to plan ahead a lot more effectively, including making sure the designs that I want to build will be usable in the future, such as allowing the engine to pass through the main hoop, and of course, making sure that it's still serviceable. For example, this tube layout works, but I wouldn't be able to remove the valve covers, and that would be a huge problem in the future. So the decision that I need to make right now is where do I want the main hoop, the main roll bar of our cage structure to land inside of this car. And if I have my way, I want it to land exactly where the B-pillar post of the original F40 was. And that's pretty much exactly how the 244 GTK is set up. The main hoop of the roll bar in this car, as built by RS Motorsport, is perfectly in line with that B-pillar post. And it hides it from view from outside the car. It looks really nice. It is unquestionably the most elegant solution, and I think it would look really good in this car as a way to kind of hybridize the aesthetic of the original F40 with it being a tube chassis car and having a roll cage. However, the problem is that the engine, the V12 that we want to fit in here, doesn't really fit behind that plane, not really well. So, can we come up with a solution that allows us to have the main hoop in line with the B-pillar post and have clearance for the engine? Can we kind of build some structure that comes out and around the front of the engine, or do we need to take the entire main hoop and bring it forward so that there's clearance but separation between the cabin and the engine? And if we bring it forward, what can we do to make it aesthetically pleasing as well as just a good mechanical solution? Because I don't want to just have a brute forced car here that took the bare minimum approach to get the job done. I want this to be a beautiful piece of art as well. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time trying to solve that, and once I decide what we're going to do, then we finish up the second dimensions of our floor and can get that built and dropped into place. Chances are you'll see a bit more of Byron in forthcoming episodes, because if you don't recognize him already, he was present for the entirety of my rusty E28 build. He's a fellow fabricator, one of my best friends, and this is our wheelhouse, so I'm excited to have his help as I continue forward too. So what are we actually building first? Well, the answer is a rough draft of the base platform of the chassis, a 41-inch by 56-inch rectangle. There's a decent chance that I go back and revise this shape in the future, but it will make a good foundation as we get started. But it's not just a rectangle. It needs to be perfectly square and perfectly flat, and for that, we're we're going to build it clamped down to our chassis table work surface. To pull that off, I'm going to need some more clamps. And that brings us to an old school episode of the 244 GTK build when I built this fabrication table and along with it a bunch of clamps that I've been using ever since. And today we're going to make a bunch more because we need a bunch more. This is one of my favorite DIY tools. I went to Harbor Freight and I bought these clamps for $3 a piece. They're super cheap. What we're going to do is we're going to cut the foot off the end of it nice and clean. I bought some 5/8 bolts that will cut the threads off for the same reason, keep it nice and aesthetic. And we're gonna weld them together just like this, but without the foot. And what it gives us is a clamp that we can use on this fabrication table or on the chassis table to hold anything down. And best of all, it's gonna save us a bunch of money because these will cost about $5 in total to make versus probably $25 if we wanna buy the real deal. You can never have too many tools, and these clamps are cheap to make, so we might as well make a bunch of them because we're gonna need them as we progress. I made 5 when I first built these a number of years ago, and I've wanted more ever since. Thankfully, Anthony, our videographer, has a brother named Alex, and he is a budding fabricator, so he swung by the shop to tackle this project for me. He cut apart our clamps, cleaned up all of the hardware, and got everything welded together, and as a result saved me an entire day of time while I could be working on the chassis itself. And there we have it, the final shape, at least for the time being. Chances are we're going to have some modifications, but this is how the pieces fit together, at least at the moment. The clamps that Alex finished up allow us to clamp it to our flat work surface and get this thing welded together. Because I might want to make some changes or revisions, I'm only going to tack the structure together, although I'll use some pretty serious tacks to pull it off. I want to make sure it's not going to break apart as I'm handling it and messing with it. To get the base structure into the car, we had to move the supports that hold the roof up. They prevent us from actually dropping this thing into place. Somewhat unsurprisingly, the parts are an exact fit. It's a snug drop into place, but once there, it fits up exactly the way that we were hoping it would. I'm going to clamp it to the bodywork itself for the time being until those brackets come from Send Cut Send, and then we'll make some final adjustments to get it into what might be a final position if I don't go cutting it apart to modify it. Overall, I'm happy with how it's turning out. I think it's what we need it to be, but the next couple of weeks and planning might reveal some changes I need to make. Last but not least, undoubtedly some of you are wondering about my choice of material. This is square. Is that what we're building this car out of? No, not at all. As promised, let's talk about material choice. Now let's talk about our choice of chassis material because as you notice, I'm currently working with rectangular stock. This stuff is not what we will be building the chassis out of, not even close. Ferrari did us dirty by building the original car with stuff like this, and it's not the elegant solution, and it's not the latest in technology. This is only, in our case, for that very base layer that's going to be close to the ground. It's going to make things like mounting underbody aero, making floor pans, and attaching seat rails a whole lot easier. But all my fabricators out there know the conundrum of trying to decide whether to use square stock for the base or round stock, because this stuff is what the heart wants. It looks so much better. It's more fun to work with. This stuff's ugly, but I think we can all agree if you're building the most practical vehicle you can, this is the way to go. Some of you guys are gonna be disappointed I'm not opting for round stock for the entire thing, but I want it to be more than just a rolling piece of art, and because the car is going to be low and have underbody aero, things like that, we're going to use this for that very base layer of tubing. Everything else that attaches to it's all gonna be round, I promise you that. Now, as far as the round material goes, this is what the actual chassis will be built out of, the entire rest of the car, 95% of it. This is Docal R8. It is currently the best of the best. It's pretty cool stuff. It is motorsport specific. It's engineered for chassis and roll cages for applications exactly like this one. What makes it special? Well, one, it's really strong stuff. You'll notice that we're going to be using 1.5" diameter 095 wall material. It's pretty small spec. Normally for DOM, this would be for a very, very lightweight car. And while this car is going to be lightweight, it's pretty big with a big engine in it. But this will still support it to any rule book for any level of crash. Although we're not building this to a rule book or to go off Pikes Peak or anything like that. This is the best of the best. It is lightweight. It's really strong. It's good stuff. Now, some of you will notice that it does have a seam in it, and you'll know that seamed tubing is not allowed in most motorsports rule books, but given that this has been tested and it's kind of the latest and greatest stuff, they're now starting to allow this and everything. It's kind of the cutting edge of technology. Now, it has a lot of similar properties to 4130 chromoly, and that's kind of previously what every really high-end chassis would be built out of, but 4130 has to be handled pretty carefully. You can cook it when you weld it. You should probably heat treat the whole thing when you're done with it, and over time, whether you do a good job or you do a bad job, it's going to crack on a long enough timeline because it does fatigue. This stuff will last forever, and I want this car to last forever. This is what we're going to be using, and I'm excited for it. Now, some of you might be wondering why not use a different material altogether? Why not just DOM, kind of the standard that everybody uses? Well, we're building an F40. I want the F40 of tubing. I want to keep this thing really lightweight, and this allows us to do that. As far as why not using something like titanium, a lot of you guys have asked, and I touched upon in our Q&A. Some of you have said Cletus McFarland's car is made of titanium, and unfortunately it's not. It has a lot of titanium parts attached to the chassis. It has a lot of titanium segments bolted within it, but the chassis itself is 4130 or some other steel alloy like this. We can incorporate titanium into this build, and we will. It's a cool material, it's incredible, it's also expensive, but you can't build an entire chassis out of titanium. We're not going to do that. This is as good as it gets as far as I'm concerned. Docal R8. Let's pair this with this for the very base layer and build the best chassis we can. I know that's a lot of work and time and effort to make a glorified square. And yeah, I know some of you guys would say I can make that in an hour. It doesn't take that much time. And you're right, but I wanted this thing to be absolutely perfect, and it is. It turned out exactly the way that I was looking for. It fits the way that I was hoping for. It is a perfectly snug fit against our flanges. It is square. It is true. And all of that's really important because to drive the point home, although this is just a simple metal square, it is the foundation of everything moving forward. And it's not to say that this is a crash structure or that it's critical in the way that the car operates, but this piece and its measurements and how it is set up on this table will be what we base everything moving forward on. And so I want to make sure that as we lock it into its final position, which is not right here, it's going to get pushed up against these end pieces once these clamps get out of the way after we get our brackets from Send Cut Send. But once we move it forward and we lock it into position and we clamp it into place, every other piece of the car will operate off of this as kind of home base, our origin point if you want to use CAD terms. So it was worth spending a lot of time to make sure that it's perfect. I'm really happy with it, and I'm having a ton of fun. I've been wanting to dive into a project of this scale for a long time, and it feels really good to get my hands dirty again. To that end, if this episode was too slow for you and you didn't like watching this much progress to make a glorified square, I got bad news, because that's what the next 2 years are going to be. This is going to document every step of the process as we build this car from scratch, from the ground up. And as I talk through just this number of details every step of the way, I'm going to talk about why I'm doing everything and all of the problem solving. I want to show the hurdles. This is climbing a mountain, and that takes time. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. I'm really looking forward to it. This is the kind of content I've been wanting to make for a long time. I hope you guys have been enjoying it. This is going to be a fun one. This is step one of many to come. Next week, we will be working on some more tube work. And for months on end, that's what it's going to be. I'm excited to see where next week's takes us. I got to do some thinking about what that next step is. But until then, enjoy this one. I'll catch you next week.